Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who are not present in the courtroom today, I want to take a minute to summarize the nature of the proceedings at our status conference on People versus Christopher Watts this afternoon. Mr. Watts entered a plea of guilty to all 9 counts in the original complaint and information. Those counts include murder in the first degree after deliberation as to Shanann Watts, murder in the first degree as to Bella Watts, murder in the first degree as to Celeste Watts, unlawful termination of a pregnancy as it relates to Nico Watts, and 3 counts of unlawful tampering with a deceased human body. There was a sentencing agreement that calls for the defendant to be sentenced to the Department of Corrections for the remainder of his natural life as to counts 1, 2, and 3. All of those sentences will run consecutively to one another. There's also an agreement that whatever sentence the court imposes as to count 6 will also run consecutively to counts 1 through 3. The remainder of the sentencing will be left to the discretion of the court. That sentencing will occur November 19th at 10 o'clock in the morning. The final piece of the sentencing agreement calls for the district attorney's office, myself, to agree that as a result of his plea of guilty, that he will not face the death penalty. I know that there are going to be a lot of questions about that, so let me address that right up front. Present here in the room with us today is Frank Rourke, Sandra Rourke, and Frank Rourke Jr., Shanann's brother, mom and dad. Mr. Wren and I flew out to North Carolina about 3 weeks ago and spent quite a bit of time with the Rourke family talking about the state of the death penalty in Colorado, the realities of the death penalty. We explained to them the extraordinary delays that currently exist in the state of Colorado as the result of, in part, the actions of our current governor. We discussed the fact that an individual by the name of Nathan Dunlap was convicted and sentenced to death in 1996 and is still alive today. We discussed all of the possible consequences, delays, penalties, timeframes, and I hope I'm saying this accurately. I know they'll correct me if I am wrong, but they were very strongly in favor of a resolution in this case short of the death penalty. That, to me, was the most important consideration in deciding how to proceed with this case. However, as they know, after we had those meetings at their home in North Carolina, I came back and had meetings with all of the law enforcement partners you see standing up here today, with the supervisors in my office, in consultation with other district attorneys around the state.
The truth rarely disappears. It waits, buried beneath sealed files, carefully worded press conferences, and conclusions that arrived far too quickly. In the early hours after the crime, when shock still clung to every street and every face, the story presented to the public felt complete. Too complete. The kind of story that closes doors instead of opening them. The kind that asks people not to look too closely. From the outside, it looked like justice moved fast. Confessions were made. Charges were filed. A narrative was built and delivered neatly to a stunned public desperate for answers. But behind the scenes, questions lingered in the silence. Evidence that surfaced briefly, then vanished from discussion. Leads that were acknowledged, then quietly abandoned. Timelines that didn't quite align, yet were never publicly challenged. Prosecutors are meant to seek truth, not just convictions. And yet, in this case, the district attorney's office appeared eager to draw a firm line under a story that still felt unfinished. Press briefings emphasized closure. Official statements reassured the community that nothing more remained to be uncovered. But closure is not the same as clarity, and certainty is not the same as truth. As records became available and documents were reviewed years later, cracks began to appear. Decisions that raised eyebrows. Evidence handling that felt selective. Public transparency that stopped just short of uncomfortable territory. None of it definitive on its own. But together, they formed a pattern. One that suggested this case may have been shaped as much by what was left out as by what was revealed. This is not a story about rewriting guilt. It is a story about power, discretion, and the uncomfortable possibility that the full truth may have been considered inconvenient. Because when the state decides which questions are worth asking and which are not, justice becomes fragile. If you're ready to follow this case beyond the official narrative, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Shadow of Deceit, and turn on notifications. What comes next challenges everything we were told to accept. Before the crime became a headline, before prosecutors stood behind microphones, there was a life that unfolded in ordinary, documented ways. Families, routines, digital footprints. The kind of background that investigators are trained to dissect carefully, because context often reveals motive, pressure, and opportunity. Yet much of this background was distilled into a simplified portrait, one that fit neatly into a narrative already forming. Friends, coworkers, and relatives described tensions that did not suddenly appear overnight. Financial strain, emotional distance, fractured relationships, these were not secrets. They were visible to anyone willing to look closely. And still, certain dynamics were minimized, while others were emphasized with precision. The story presented to the public focused narrowly on one path, even as other avenues quietly branched off and were never followed to their ends. Digital data told its own story. Phone records, location pings, deleted searches, communication logs, each one capable of expanding the scope of the investigation. But instead of being explored publicly in full, much of this sea then sealed behind conclusions that discouraged further scrutiny. The message was clear. The important work had already been done. Yet investigators know that early assumptions can shape everything that follows. Once a narrative is locked in, evidence is no longer neutral. It becomes filtered. Supporting details are highlighted. Contradictions are explained away. And anything that threatens the structure of the case risks being labeled irrelevant or speculative. The district attorney's office held immense influence at this stage. Choices about what to pursue, what to test, and what to disclose would determine not just the outcome of the case, but the public's understanding of it for years to come. Transparency became selective, and silence filled the gaps where questions should have lived. If this story feels heavier than what you remember, that's because we're slowing it down, examining the pieces that were rushed past. If you want to keep digging beneath the surface, make sure you're subscribed to Shadow of Deceit, like this video, and turn on notifications. As the investigation moved forward, the gaps became harder to ignore. Certain decisions were made quickly, too quickly for a case layered with complexity. Warrants were narrow. Interviews were limited. Follow-up questions that could have opened new lines of inquiry were either delayed or never asked at all. What should have been a widening circle of scrutiny instead began to close in on a single conclusion. Evidence, when presented publicly, arrived already framed. Timelines were summarized instead of dissected. Technical findings were reduced to headlines rather than explained in full. The language used by prosecutors was confident, final, and absolute, leaving little room for uncertainty, even where uncertainty clearly existed. In doing so, the process appeared less like an exploration for truth and more like a presentation designed to reassure. Behind the scenes, records show that some materials were never fully examined in open court. Others were referenced but not released. Requests for clarification were met with procedural answers rather than substantive ones. And while this is not unusual in criminal cases, the scale of omission here raised quiet concerns among observers who understood what was missing. What happens when investigators stop asking, "What else?" What happens when a case is resolved so cleanly that no loose ends are permitted to remain visible? The justice system relies not only on outcomes, but on trust, and trust is built through transparency. When that transparency feels selective, doubt fills the space it leaves behind. Families searched for closure. The public searched for understanding. But the official narrative offered certainty without depth, answers without explanation. And for many, that certainty felt premature. This is the moment where questions begin to outnumber statements, where confidence starts to look like control, and where the role of the district attorney shifts from truth seeker to gatekeeper. If you're following this story because you sense there's more beneath the surface, make sure you're subscribed to Shadow of Deceit. Like this video, turn on notifications and stay with us, because the next chapter examines what happens when the case moves from investigation to courtroom, and what may have been left behind in that transition. When the case reached its most critical phase, the focus narrowed even further. The crime itself, its sequence, its mechanics, its unanswered moments, was presented as settled fact. Yet beneath that surface certainty lay details that never fully aligned. Timelines overlapped awkwardly. Digital data raised questions it did not resolve. And physical evidence, while compelling, did not always tell a complete story on its own. Investigators relied heavily on a narrative that required no resistance. A confession simplified everything. It removed the need for extended forensic debate, eliminated the risk of contradictory expert testimony, and spared the court from a prolonged trial. Confessions, after all, are powerful, but they are not infallible, and when a confession closes doors instead of opening them, it deserves closer scrutiny, not less. Some evidence was interpreted narrowly, filtered through the lens of a predetermined outcome. Alternative explanations were acknowledged briefly, then dismissed. Lines of inquiry that could have complicated the story were quietly abandoned, not because they were disproven, but because they were inconvenient. In the end, the crime was framed as singular, isolated, and fully understood, even as unresolved questions lingered.
Interrogation. The interview with his mistress, and new tonight at 10, Chris Watts on video failing a polygraph test.
Well, Denver 7's Jackie Cray is here now. She's been combing through some of this new video, and it is pretty disturbing, Jackie.
It is. Included in that new batch of video is body camera video from investigators as they searched Chris Watts' home for evidence. At the same time, Watts plays to our cameras on his front porch, pleading for Shanann, Celeste, and Bella's safe return.
Hi, are you Chris?
Chris, yes.
Chris, Officer Wines with the Frederick Police Department.
This is our first glimpse into the crime scene through the eyes of investigators.
Purse is still there. The phone's on the couch. Like her wedding ring's sitting on the nightstand. It's like there's like no sign of Bella, Celeste, or anywhere.
During a 6-hour interrogation, Chris Watts joked, even laughed while answering morbid questions from detectives.
What are ways that you can make someone disappear?
I mean, like, is it talking about like what I've seen like on the movies, or like how people, if you read about other people, I mean, you hire somebody.
Like a hitman?
Yeah, I mean, I had nothing to do with what's going on right now. I did not physically harm her.
He claimed his wife and their children vanished and tried to keep the lies going during a polygraph test.
Did you physically cause Shanann's disappearance?
No.
If we do end up finding your wife and your 2 girls murdered, what do you think should happen to that person that would have done that?
The worst possible thing.
Like what?
I mean, it's either going to be like life in prison or the death penalty, isn't it? That's the only 2 things you really can do.
The 33-year-old never confesses to killing all 3, instead creates a lie about Shanann murdering the girls. But prosecutors say his motive was a fresh start. He'd already begun an affair with a co-worker, Nicole Kessinger.
It wasn't, hey, we should get married, and hey, we should have babies, and hey, I want to live with you, and hey, I need to meet your children now, and let's cut the mom out. It was never like that.
Watts kept photos of her hidden in a secret app on his phone. Kessinger says Watts lied to her too.
You found out that his
in the background. This is where the idea of a cover-up becomes controversial. Not a dramatic conspiracy, but something subtler. A strategic silence. A decision to protect the integrity of a resolution rather than the integrity of the process. In high-profile cases, finality can be more valuable than truth. Closure can take precedence over clarity. And once a case is officially closed, reopening it becomes almost impossible, not because new facts do exist, but because admitting uncertainty threatens the system itself. If this chapter is making you rethink what you thought you knew, make sure you're subscribed to Shadow of Deceit. Like this video, turn on notifications and stay with us, because the next chapter steps inside the courtroom, where decisions made behind closed doors became permanent, and where justice may have stopped asking questions. All right. As the investigation moved forward, its pace accelerated in a way that felt less like discovery and more like consolidation. Evidence was gathered quickly, categorized efficiently, and presented with confidence. But speed in cases like this can be a double-edged blade. What moves fast can also move past things that deserve to be examined slowly. Digital records became central: phone pings, deleted messages, metadata, and timelines reconstructed down to the minute. Yet not all data was pursued with equal intensity. Some devices were searched thoroughly, while others were only partially examined. Certain communications were labeled irrelevant before their context was fully understood. The absence of data was treated as confirmation, rather than a reason to dig deeper. Witness statements followed a similar pattern. Early interviews shaped the direction of the case, and later accounts were measured against that initial framework. When statements aligned, they were reinforced. When they didn't, they were explained away as confusion, misremembering, or emotional distortion. Inconsistencies were not explored as potential signals, but as obstacles to be managed. Behind the scenes, prosecutorial strategy began to take shape. The goal was no longer to ask what happened, but to prove what had already been decided. Every case needs a theory, but when a theory hardens too quickly, it stops being tested. It becomes protected. This is where questions about the district attorney's role emerge. Decisions about what evidence to emphasize, what experts to consult, and what investigative avenues to abandon all pass through a single gate. None of these choices were illegal. None were overtly deceptive, but collectively they narrowed the truth instead of expanding it. By the time the investigation concluded, the story presented to the public felt complete, clean, final. And yet, beneath that polished surface, fragments remained, unexplored leads, unanswered anomalies, and choices that quietly shaped the outcome long before a courtroom was ever entered. By the time the case reached the courtroom, the outcome already felt predetermined. The machinery of justice moved with confidence, guided by a narrative that had been carefully assembled long before a judge ever took the bench. This was no longer an investigation. It was a presentation. Key evidence was introduced selectively, framed to reinforce the prosecution's version of events. Motions narrowed what could be discussed. Lines of questioning were limited. Certain topics were deemed irrelevant, not because they lacked importance, but because they threatened to complicate a story built on clarity and finality. Complexity, after all, creates doubt, and doubt is the enemy of conviction. The defense faced an uphill battle. Without full access to every investigative thread, without the ability to challenge early assumptions, their role became reactive rather than exploratory. Legal strategy shifted toward damage control instead of truth-seeking. What might have been a deeply contested trial instead moved toward resolution with startling speed. Plea discussions entered the picture, carrying the weight of inevitability. The promise of avoiding prolonged proceedings, sparing families further pain, and securing a guaranteed outcome became powerful motivators. In exchange, questions would go unanswered. Lines of inquiry would close forever. The case would end, not with certainty, but with agreement. Sentencing followed swiftly. The judgment was severe, final, and publicly reassuring. Justice, it seemed, had been served. The community exhaled. Officials spoke of closure. The district attorney stood behind the outcome as proof of diligence and integrity. But closure can be deceptive, because while the legal process had ended, the unanswered questions had not. Decisions made in quiet rooms, about evidence withheld, angles abandoned, and truths simplified, were now locked behind sealed records and legal finality. The courtroom delivered a verdict, but it did not deliver clarity, and for some, it raised a more unsettling possibility: that justice was achieved not by revealing everything, but by choosing what the public would never see. Here's Chapter 8, Conclusion and Closing Subscription CTA. Even years later, the echoes of that night remain vivid in the minds of those left behind. Friends, family, and an entire community struggled to reconcile the images of a life once vibrant with the brutality of its sudden end. Every memory of laughter, every snapshot of innocence, is now haunted by the shadow of betrayal and violence. The finality of prison walls cannot erase the questions that linger, the suspicions that never fully fade, and the secrets that may never see the light of day. Chris Watts' confessions offered fragments of truth, but the silence between the lines speaks louder than any statement. The public received pieces, carefully curated and filtered through legal proceedings and media narratives. Yet the human cost, the pain etched into faces, the sleepless nights, the relentless grief, cannot be quantified, contained, or neatly concluded. Each anniversary of that tragedy reminds the world that some wounds remain open, bleeding quietly beneath the surface of daily life. Justice was served in courtrooms and through sentences, yet the moral reckoning continues. How do we measure closure when the mechanisms of the system obscure the full story? How do we process evil when it masquerades as the familiar, the trustworthy, the ordinary? The truth revealed in confessions is only a partial reflection of the darkness that existed. And in that reflection, we are forced to confront not just the crime, but the uncomfortable realities about human nature, deception, and the fragility of trust. As you sit with these revelations, consider this. What would you have done if you glimpsed the signs before it was too late? How far would you go to uncover the truth? If this story gripped you, hit like, share this video, and subscribe to Shadow of Deceit for more deep dives into cases where the lines between truth, deception, and justice blur. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a dark revelation from the world of true crime.
No, I gave him an out. I mean, he went to my colonoscopy. I tortured him. I rejected him. I pushed him away time and time and time again. But when I canceled dates last minute, because that's how life is with my health challenges, you cancel things last minute, and it's hard for people to get. It's hard for me to understand. But he stuck around, and he stuck around because he was the one for me. And he is amazing. And I can't tell you how wonderful he is. All of this comes from all of this positivity that I'm sharing. My 2 children are because of all of this. Like, all of this. My health challenges happened for a reason. I was told I couldn't have kids, you know? And here I have 2 amazing, crazy, wild children. I love dearly. And everything happens for a reason. So if you're at a place where you feel, Dieter, you feel like life's standing on top of you and attacking you, write down. This is homework for everyone, and I do this all the time because I have to life happens. So write down all the things that you think are bad in your life, all the negative in your life. Write it down. But then I want you to also, on the other side of the paper, write down what has happened in your life that you're grateful for. The third step is take a pen and mark over, like, connect the 2 things that happened. So, for instance, health challenges, Chris, Mandy, life, right? I can write that I can connect that life health challenge to Mandy. I can connect it to Chris, and I can connect it to everything else that happened because of my health challenges. So do you see what I'm trying to do here? Like, I want you to connect the negatives with the positives in your life. And when you look at that, life becomes so much brighter. Like, so much brighter when you can do that.
My daughter and my grandchildren, they had beautiful lives. They loved each other. Beautiful, yes, inside and out.
I have no idea who gave you the right to take their lives, but I know God and his mighty angels were there at that moment to bring them home to paradise.